Good afternoon, or maybe good evening, depending on what part of the United States you are tuned in from. My name is Tom Woodward. I'm the Executive Director of the C.S. Lewis Society, and it's my pleasure to bring you the last of our Cutting Edge Apologetics webinars. We are really excited that you joined us, and I just want to let you know that we're also excited, especially excited that Dr. Jonathan Wells has joined us from his office on the West Coast. Greetings, Dr. Jonathan Wells. Hope you're doing well.
I am, Tom. Pleasure to be here.
That's great to have you. Well, I just want to say that I'm going to be introducing Dr. Wells in just a moment. We have a few kind of housekeeping things to share with you so that you know what's coming up and how you can be involved in asking questions. So before we get started, I'd like to just go over these housekeeping items and say that we'll be using an interview format. And I'll be asking Dr. Wells some questions kind of revolving around zombie science. This is the title of one of his most recent books. It's an exciting extension of his most famous blockbuster book, Icons of Evolution. And so we'll be taking about 30 to 35 minutes as I go through these questions. And then we will open it up to the general public. And so you yourself can craft a question. You just go to the Q&A function box, and you can just write your question in there. And any of those questions that you see in the Q&A, you can also upvote by using the thumbs up icon. And just keep in mind that we may consolidate questions, and also we, in a number of cases, have also received ahead of time some questions that people are interested in us asking of Dr. Jonathan Wells. So I'm going to be going ahead and introducing him. I just confirmed that he was admitted to the class of 1964 at Princeton University. My brother Bill was there, and I was, of course, just a few years after that. So he walked the hallowed halls of Nassau Hall and environment, actually served in the Army, finished his undergraduate degree at Berkeley, and then wound up getting 2 doctorates, one at Yale University, in which he did research on the historical backgrounds of the Darwinian theory, and then later in cell biology at the University of California at Berkeley, which was the foundation of much of his research that he's done in biology and the biology of Darwinian theory and the biology of design ever since. He is the author, of course, of Icons of Evolution, which really kind of broke ground in exposing some problems, the problematic nature of many of the proof pictures, charts, other visual aspects of the support supposedly that is presented in public textbooks for Darwinian theory. And of course, he followed up with a masterpiece, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design, the second masterpiece, and then a series of other mini masterpieces, if I can call them that, Zombie Science among them, of course, The Myth of Junk DNA, one of my favorite books that you have authored. Dr. Jonathan Wells, we are really privileged to have you with us, and you are known for keeping up on this area of evidence that is reputed to strongly support, maybe even be a slam dunk, for just showing Darwinian theory as rock solid fact. Show us a little bit about how the Icons of Evolution is like the foundation, which then has been updated and extended in zombie science. If you can give us an overview of that.
Well, an icon is an image. And I discovered during my years at Berkeley, getting my doctorate in biology, that many of the images used in textbooks as evidence for Darwinian evolution actually misrepresent the evidence or actually fake it. And that's what I wrote about in Icons of Evolution. In Zombie Science, which came out in 2017, 17 years later, I showed that these icons are still with us. Some have been modified slightly, some details have been changed, but many textbooks still carry them as though they were evidence for Darwinian evolution, which they are not.
And so in Zombie Science, you actually treat and update the information on the original, if I remember, there were about 10 of the icons, and then you added, what, another 5 or so in the Zombie?
Six more.
So in the zombie book, we have a kind of a secondary jackpot. We get a review of the original 10, and then we have this miniature explosion of an additional 6 supposed proofs that you reveal the misinformation. Sometimes it's fakery, and even in one case, outright fraud, which we will get to in a moment. So give us the big picture, the famous, tree of life that is treated, very important image that shows that we're all interrelated, genealogically through some kind of gradual developmental process. Tell us how you approach that in either or both of your books.
Sure. Let me begin briefly by explaining what I mean by zombie science, if you don't mind. Science at its best is the search for truth, and we search for truth by comparing our ideas with evidence. If they fit the evidence, then we tentatively accept them as true. But there's another kind of science that has become very popular, widespread since Darwin mainly. I call it materialistic science. And instead of searching for the truth, it searches for materialistic explanations for everything. Now, when materialistic science, which isn't really empirical science, keeps telling its stories, even when they don't fit the evidence, that is, when the stories are empirically dead, I call that zombie science. So that's what I found in the textbooks. I found it in 2000, I found it again in 2017. The tree of life is Darwin's central metaphor. He saw life as a huge branching tree with the first species at the root and the trunk, and then the modern species being the leaves on the branches. So all life for him was interconnected by this unbroken line of ancestry and descent. If the tree of life is true, there can only be one true tree. And yet, when we look at the evidence, both the anatomical evidence and more recently the molecular evidence, we find multiple conflicting trees. There is no consensus tree. And the more we find, the more evidence we find, the worse things get. And so when this is presented as a fact to biology students, that's a misrepresentation of the truth.
Well, then, I mean, that to me, just hearing you say that, and this is not, totally new news, but I imagine a lot of the people hearing this tonight will say, what does the other side say? How can they present this coherent image of a unified, all the data shows us this wonderful branching tree of life when, data set A says this kind of tree and data set B says, no, it's over here. How can they deal with the incoherence or the skewed nature of different trees mutually incompatible?
Well, I can't speak to individuals, how they deal with it individually. What I do know from being part of the biological community for a while, until I was expelled, is that in private, they admit these problems. It's when they present a public face that they cannot afford to let the story, that is the materialistic story, unravel. And so they sort of close ranks and defend the tree idea. Not all of them, but many of them, and certainly the textbooks do.
Wow. Well, let's jump right into one of the most famous examples, and I'll admit that I was complicit. I was not brought up before a magistrate and charged with any felony or misdemeanor, but I was complicit in fraud in actually perpetrating on my high school class in Canal Winchester, Ohio, near Columbus, in the probably the fall of '65, my freshman year in high school. I was complicit in pushing the Heckle Embryos story, which my father had shown me from his collegiate textbook, which I thought, this is just amazing proof of evolution. We have gill slits, we went through a fish phase when we were in our mommy's, womb. I'm going to take this into my biology teacher, and I did so, and he used it. He showed it to the whole class. So I confess my complicity in one of the zombie stories. Show us, if you could, maybe those Heckle embryos. I think you may have a set of drawings. Tell us what happened and why is it fraudulent or whatever.
Yes, these are Heckle's drawings.
Hmm.
Are they I think that's the whole picture right there.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
So there's a fish, a salamander, a chick, a turtle, and 4 mammals. And at the top, according to Heckle, we see the earliest stages of these embryos, and they all look pretty much the same. So he argued that this similarity, actually Darwin took him up on this too, this similarity in their earliest stage means that they come from a common ancestor. So this drawing was used for many decades, since 1868, as evidence for Darwin's theory that we all come from a common ancestor in the tree of life. Well, even during Darwin's time, these drawings were exposed as fakes by his contemporaries. The actual evidence shows something more like this, and I'll have to move it around so you can see the whole thing. Down here, next to the bottom, these are the real embryos at the stage that Heckle made them look so much similar. They're not similar at all, not really, they're distinguishable. But Heckle made them all look pretty much the same, as in the top row here. So that alone was a misrepresentation of the truth. But even worse than that, what Heckle called the first stage, and Darwin too assumed to be the first stage, was not the first stage at all. Here are the earlier stages, starting with the egg, the 4-cell stage, other stages. These different classes are clearly distinguishable all along the way. And they do converge here to be somewhat similar, although not as similar as Heckle made them out to be, but they start out very different. A mammal egg, for example, a mammal embryo, divides totally differently than, say, a fish or a frog. And so the misrepresentation goes further than the alleged similarities of the stage that Heckle picked.
That's remarkable, and to think that it went on and on and on for decade after decade. I mean, my dad's textbook at Princeton was printed in maybe around 1922, 24. And I showed it to my class in 68, didn't have the slightest idea I was showing fraudulent fakery, which was already rebuked in the 1800s. How did this, I find this amazing. How did this go on so long with no one blowing the whistle on it?
Well, people did blow the whistle from time to time, but they were ignored. Now, when I went to Berkeley to study biology as a PhD student, I got to look at the actual embryos, and that's when I got a clue that they weren't as similar as Heckle made them out to be. And when I dug deeper, I found out that that had been known for quite some time. In 2000, the year I published Icons, Stephen Jay Gould, famous evolutionary biologist, said we should be ashamed and astonished at the way these drawings have been reproduced for decades in our textbooks. Well, it's been going on ever since then. As I show in Zombie Science, they're still with us, these drawings, or modified versions of them, and they still claim to show the same thing, but they misrepresent the evidence. So they're not empirical science, they're materialistic science.
I think your phrase you used in one, I don't know which place, and maybe one of the chapters of Icons, or maybe it was in defending your book Icons from the assault. I think you called it survival of the fakest. I think that's a beautiful way to survive. Instead of survival of the fittest in proofs of evolution, survival of the fakest. Didn't you coin that?
No, I didn't. I did publish an article by that name in the American Spectator, but the editor at that time, Josh Gilder, actually coined that phrase.
Okay.
And it's a wonderful one.
Yeah. So you went along with it, okay, or you were okay with that?
Absolutely, because that's the way it is.
Well, let's move from Ernst Haeckel, this German faker, this embryologist who basically scammed us in the proof of, evolutionary theory from embryos. Let's jump into this supposed proof from finches. I'd like to spend a little time there. The famous finches of the Galapagos Island are slam dunk, we are told over and over. Proof, the Rosemary, I think Grant and her husband,
Peter Grant.
Yeah, Peter and Rosemary Grant went from Princeton and made their career studying the finches. Is that not proof that species can evolve? It's happening right under our nose. What do you say about that?
Well, evolve is a very slippery term. I mean, if evolve means changes from generation to generation, sure, we evolve. We see it in our own families. But the finches on the Galapagos have been used for many decades in biology textbooks as evidence that the different species of finch on the islands evolved from a common ancestor by natural selection. The key there is natural selection. So the finches are distinguished mainly by the shapes and sizes of their beaks, not only, but mainly. And these beaks are adapted to different sorts of food that is found on the island, seeds or whatever. And the story is that Darwin noticed this, and actually it was a key cornerstone of his theory. So they're called Darwin's finches. But in fact, he hardly noticed them at all when he was there. And they weren't called Darwin's finches until a century after he had visited the Galapagos. Well, still in the 70s, Peter and Rosemary Grant visited the islands. They observed one species in particular very, very closely in great detail. And as luck would have it, luck for them, not for the birds, there was a severe drought the following year that killed 85% of the finches in the population. And the ones that survived had, on average, slightly larger beaks to crack the harder seeds. Well, the finches and their colleagues at that time predicted that if there was to be such a drought every, say, 20 years, then in maybe 200 years, these finches could become a different species because of the changes in their beaks. What is generally not mentioned in the, excuse me, in the textbooks is that after the drought passed and the rains came back, the average beak size went back to normal. So there was no real evolution at all. There was natural selection, but not the kind of evolution that Darwin wanted to see.
So we see a fine example of natural selection at work, but doing not that much, nothing to get really worked up about, because it's working around kind of an oscillation around a medium or a center point. Is that right?
That's correct. And actually, all natural selection did was kill off the birds with the smaller beaks, which came back as nature would have it when the rains returned.
Well, that's an interesting addendum to other similar proofs that you have discussed in your book, such as the ape turning into a man. We could maybe go into that during the Q&A general section of time, but I want to just burrow in on a topic of great interest to me. I have in our family tree some very interesting eye abnormalities. There is a retinoblastoma gene in my own family. You may have heard of the retinoblastoma gene that causes a runaway
Yes.
in age 1 or 2, usually little toddlers or even before that. And so, there are examples of that in my immediate family. But you have covered the attack on the eye as poorly designed. Ken Miller, I believe, at Brown University in days past has targeted the eye. How could a wise creator produce such an abomination of design? Could you take us right into these typical attacks and maybe what we're learning about this whole area that is turning the corner?
Absolutely. Here's the problem in a nutshell. You see the human eye over here. Light passes through the cornea and lands on the retina, the light-sensitive spot at the back. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a cross-section, a close-up of the retina. These are nerve cells. These are the light-sensing cells, and these are blood cells. Now, notice that the light-sensing cells face away from the light. So the retina, according to Darwinians, is backwards and therefore obviously badly designed. That's the argument. But the truth is this: the nerve cells are almost transparent. the blood cells and the blood that nourishes these very sensitive cells is opaque. So if you were to turn this retina around, we'd all be blind. So the poorly designed argument falls flat on its face.
Okay, and so, I mean, I've also heard that there are very important Mueller glial, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, cells that penetrate through the retina, and don't those actually act as like optical fibers, actually filtering the light, preparing it to hit the rods and cones?
Yes, that's a fairly recent discovery. That's a Mueller cell. That's a Mueller cell. And you see they guide light through here right to the light sensing parts of the cones and the rods. So, but even without those, the retina as it is, as we have it, is a better retina than it would be if the blood were in front of the light sensing cells. We wouldn't be able to see anything.
Remarkable. I mean, how often are these facts mentioned in public textbooks? I would wager rarely, if ever. Am I
Very
right?
rarely, very rarely. And defenders of Darwinism, now in Darwinism, the main point here is that there is no design. Everything is by accident, by natural selection, or what Phil Johnson once called non-random death. And that has no creative power. So when we see bad design, then Darwinists argue that that's evidence for their theory. When we see good design, that doesn't fit Darwinism at all. And they have misused the eye, the human eye, as an example of poor design, when actually it's an example of excellent design.
Well, that brings me to another similar parallel attack on on bodily design, and that is our hard drive, the DNA, that records not only the wonderful, protein coding genes, 20,000, maybe higher than that in the count, but we also have RNA genes. I've heard somebody say hundreds of thousands of those perhaps are being discovered. But we've been told by many people, and even yet today, I mean, I've in the last couple of months, I've had people confront me with the idea of most of our DNA is junk. It's accumulated trash that is carried along on the bus, so to speak, through just replication of cells, has no use, doesn't do anything, hasn't had a use in eons. How do you see this shaping up, the whole area of junk DNA? And then maybe we can slide, if we have time, for another question in the embryo, the information embryo. But let's zoom in on junk DNA, because I think that's important.
Well, up until about 15 years ago, the story among biologists, Darwinian biologists, was that most of our DNA is junk. And that's because only about 2% of human DNA encodes proteins. And the way things used to be viewed, proteins were all that mattered. And the rest was just, as you say, accumulated junk over the eons of evolution. But then about 15 years ago, scientists who just ignored the story and looked at the evidence started discovering that most of this so-called junk actually has a function. Perhaps 80%, perhaps 90%, perhaps more. It's not protein coding, but it's still functional. Without it, we wouldn't be able to operate. Well, pushing back against that, some Darwinists have defended the notion of junk DNA with the following argument, and I think you'll get a kick out of this. The argument essentially is, if most of our DNA is not junk, then evolution, Darwinian evolution, is false. But we know that Darwinian evolution is true, therefore most of it has to be junk. Forget the evidence. That's the logic, which I find rather funny, except it's sad at the same time because so many people fall for it.
I mean, that's sheer illogic. I mean, that's like a fifth grade, well, maybe junior high example of how not to argue. I mean, those premises do not follow one another logically. I'm just amazed. We're bordering on self-delusion.
Well, the premise that Darwinian evolution has to be true is, of course, false. And so the argument may be logical, but it ends up being wrong. Now, why is that premise so widely accepted? And I would argue that it's the basis for a materialistic origins story. We know that materialism has to be true, therefore Darwinism has to be true, or something like it. So the philosophy of materialism takes precedence over the evidence. And that to me is not empirical science.
Wow. Well, we have time for one other good juicy question. I think before we take some questions, we have some questions rolling in already. We're excited to see that. And I'd like to deal with this whole issue of the embryo. The embryo has been an intense object of study in recent decades because it seems like there might be potentially more information encoded than just the bare DNA. And of course, I in my teaching and our writing, Dr. Gills and I have represented the mysterious epigenome, the methyl tagging and other tags and flags that appear on the spooling devices, the histones where the DNA is coiled up. But I think you've shown, and some of your most cutting edge research is in this area of the embryo. Tell us about the exciting kind of projects, research, cutting edge horizons that you're pushing back in what you're finding with the information in embryos.
Well, you're quite right in saying that there is information in the way the DNA is packaged, not just in the DNA sequences themselves, but there's information even beyond that. And I'll show you briefly why. This is the development of a Drosophila or fruit fly egg. Here it's starting out, getting bigger. These large cells here are called nurse cells, and the actual egg is here on the right. It's my right anyway, as I look at it. So this egg has a head and a tail. When it's born, when it's laid by the fly. The tail is determined by, or partly determined by, an RNA called nanos, and the head by one called bicoid. Well, these localize to this is the tail, this is the head, but when these first enter the egg from the nurse cells, they're just sort of put in willy-nilly, and then they migrate to their spots. Well, the reason they do that is those spots are already predetermined. You can see there's a shape to this egg from the very beginning. It was not determined by the DNA products. Instead, the location of the DNA products is determined by the information that's already in the egg. And I've argued and provided evidence that this is true in general, that eggs, not just eggs, but actually cells, contain spatial information that's there before the DNA is activated. And that spatial information is not reducible to DNA. And it's actually been quite well studied by some scientists. There's something called the membrane code. It takes one form it takes is the sugar code, which is independent of the DNA, the electric code. All of these codes are independent, not totally independent, but they exist apart from the DNA sequences. And without taking those into account, there's no way we can explain embryo development.
Wow. We are swimming in exciting news and information that is both thrilling and maybe a little bit challenging for our listeners, because this is all new for many of us. And I'll just say this, that when I coined with Dr. Gills, the eye surgeon here in Florida, when we coined the zygote code, I think we ran it by you and said, does that make sense for us to call this incredible concentration of information found in the fertilized egg a kind of its own unique code? And I think you gave us the green light that it's okay to use that. It's just a kind of a tentative description. So what you're referring to really is like an expansion. I mean, it's taking us into the particulars of the zygote code.
Yes, I mean, DNA certainly contains a code.
Mhm.
I'm not denying that.
Of course.
And as you showed, the way the DNA is packaged contains a code. But now we know there are multiple codes layered on top of that.
Fantastic breakthrough knowledge for each one of us. Well, I'm going to shift gears for just a few moments and introduce our second part of our webinar with Dr. Jonathan Wells. As we mentioned earlier, he has earned a couple of doctorates in the history of this debate and also cell biology. And so you can ask not only questions of the history of the debate and cell biology, but anything pertaining to this topic. And he'll take it on with great enjoyment and glee. We're going to be using this procedure. We're going to be doing a kind of a question by question as they have been submitted. We have about a half a dozen ready to go. I'll be asking Dr. Wells, of course, these questions one at a time. You can still, it's not too late, you can still write your question right there on the Q&A box that you have in front of you. And you can also upload or you can upvote any question that you may want to just see there. And they're all viewable. And that will cause us to tend to go with those that have the most votes. And we're going to be concluding in about 20 minutes or so, which would be, I guess, 8:20 East Coast, maybe 5:20 if you're on the West Coast, and in between, you can figure that out. So we're going to go ahead with our first question. And I'm going to go ahead and just say that with the amount of proof that is available now to refute Darwinian evolution, this zombie science, how can schools be allowed to kind of reach into this area, read the material, and take this method of exposure? In other words, how can we grapple with philosophies that are requiring children to be only hearing one side? Is there something of hearing the critical analysis side that you and your folks at Discovery can recommend?
Well, that's the question of the day. I've been working at it for more than 20 years now. I don't know any solution. I have no magic solution to that other than to keep trying to educate people about the actual evidence and point out that Darwinism, Darwinian evolution, is in fact materialistic philosophy rather than true science. But with children constantly exposed to the materialistic philosophy and denied access to the evidence, it's quite a challenge, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I think homeschooling has been very successful at it. I know it has. But homeschooling is a lot of trouble for parents.
Remarkable. Well, we're all dealing with that at whatever level that we have members of our family, some students I have here at our campus at Trinity College come from homeschool, some from Christian schools, some from private and then public. And it seems like the exposure and the attempt to indoctrinate an evolution is all over the map, of course, especially in the public schools. It's pretty heavy. But we have a commentator, a questioner rather, from a person up in Montreal. And I think I'm not pronouncing that correct in the French pronunciation, but that's my best attempt in American verbiage. Thank you, Dr. Wells. I didn't know, says this person, that you had been expelled. Was it over a specific paper or book that you published? Interesting question.
Well, I was fortunate in not being expelled the way some of my colleagues were. That is, I did not lose my job, because when I published Icons of Evolution and other books, I was already working for Discovery Institute, which, as you know, is famous for being critical of Darwinian evolution. I was expelled in the sense that I was defamed. I have a mock award here on my wall in my office that my colleagues gave me in 2002. It's the Most Hated Man in America award. And I have a whole filing cabinet full of the vilification that I received. I've been called a liar, vicious, a terrorist because I try to speak the truth about the evidence. But according to Darwinists, modern civilization itself depends on materialism. And so for someone like me to criticize that philosophy is an act of terrorism, intellectual terrorism. So I was canceled more than expelled, unlike some of my colleagues. I'm not recommending that you do this, but if you go to my Wikipedia page, it's all bad. I mean, if anyone that reads that would not want to have anything to do with me, I think.
Wow. I'm sorry to hear all of that junk that's been thrown at you, and I applaud you for standing firm. And I know you as one of the most gentle and gracious people in the scientific world I've ever met. So you are a scientific giant, but I would call you a gentle giant. I appreciate your spirit of humility and just the highest of character. So let me just bring in one of the questions. I think it's very practical from one of our listeners is, what is your favorite evidence for design? And there's, you've mentioned a couple things, maybe the embryo code is among them, but what that you haven't mentioned maybe would be one of your favorite evidences for design that's come to light.
Well, in biology, for me, it is the embryo. In many aspects of the embryo, but for some of my colleagues, it's other things. For Michael Behe, for example, as you may have heard in this series, it's the bacterial flagellum, a little molecular motor that spins the flagellum that makes the bacterium move through the fluid it's in. I think the eye is a marvelous example of design. I could list other things about the human body that I think are best explained by design. So I see design just about everywhere I look.
Fantastic. We have on the other side, someone has said, in your take, what is the evolutionist's remaining best argument, and how do we need to confront or deal with that remaining best argument on the table? That's an interesting question.
Well, in dealing with that, I think, first of all, it's important to distinguish what one means by evolution. If evolution simply means that we have species with us now that weren't there before, so there have been changes in the history of life, I have no problem with that. I think there's lots of evidence for that. It's when someone extrapolates that to imply that this all happened by, as Phil Johnson, as Phil Johnson called it, non-random death, rather than design. That extrapolation deserves to be challenged. Not the evidence for change over time, that's undeniable, but the link, the logical, illogical link as it is between that and the idea that this is all undesigned.
Very significant. We have one question that is, to me, fascinating. I guess I don't know what to call it other than that. Maybe you'll find this, causes a little bit of a humor moment. A species that I have not heard of before called, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Amphiuma. It's a salamander, and it exhibits one, according to this questioner, one of the largest complements of DNA in the living world, around 25 times more than a human. So I guess that's somewhere near, instead of 3 billion, or if you include both the diploid, I guess it would be 6.2 billion, but this would be some 25 times there. I know that salamanders and newts often have outrageously sized genomes. I guess they call it the C value, the sheer size of the genome. So has there been any attempt to explain this in the literature? Why would salamanders or newts or such creatures have such outrageously huge genomes?
Well, in a nutshell, I don't know. not only salamanders, but frogs. The frog I studied in my graduate work, the African clawed frog, has a huge genome, which is why people in my field did research on fruit flies rather than on frogs when it came to genetics. The C-value paradox is an interesting question. Lots of plants have huge genomes. The onion, for example, I don't know why. But to argue that because it has so much DNA, therefore, I don't know what's being argued, that it has to be an accident. I don't see that at all. I don't see how that follows. But there are creatures that do have that, and I don't know why.
So it doesn't really necessarily pose a problem for design theory. It's an oddity that either side would have to explain, I would think. Correct?
Yes, I would say that.
Okay. We have a new question that just rolled in. I hear that high school and college textbooks generally run about 20 years behind the science. That's an interesting observation from this questioner. It's been about 20 years since Icons was published. Are you seeing any beginning of changes in how the textbooks are handling some of these seemingly outrageously bad ideas?
Well, I certainly had hoped so when I published Icons in 2000. When I went back and reviewed more recent textbooks in 2017, I found that in fact the icons are still with us. So for me, it's evidence that what matters to the people pushing this stuff is the materialistic story, the philosophy. And that actually comes through in some books. But the books don't follow the evidence by and large. And maybe textbooks never do, but then students should not be told that this is the way things are. They're being taught a philosophical view, not an empirical one.
So we're really not seeing a thoroughgoing correction or reform in the quality and the accuracy of the complete information package presented about the icons. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that happen across the textbook industry.
No, we're not. But when you think about it, Heckle's embryos were exposed in the 1860s, and they were appearing in textbooks all the way up until, well, actually 2017. So the philosophy has a way of surviving in spite of the facts.
Sadly true, sadly true. Let me bring on a very interesting question from another participant, Doug Axe's work. And of course, he's a colleague of both of us that we appreciate so greatly. His book, Undeniable, is undeniably one of the great works of intelligent design. But this questioner asks, Doug Axe's work on the probability of randomly generating a new protein is pretty compelling. In light of that, how do we account for kinds? In other words, the different animal or plant kinds. A miniature poodle and a wolf are so dramatically different. You could make a case for them being a different species. What then, according to this question, what then are the limits of natural selection or speciation or macroevolution versus microevolution? Actually, microevolution, which is the one a kind of evolution that we view as somewhat plausible, at least somewhat plausible.
Well, as evolutionary biologist himself wrote many decades ago, Theodosius Dobzhansky, microevolution refers to the changes, relatively minor changes, we can observe in a human lifetime within a single species, as in within dogs, for example. Macroevolution takes place over geological time, and there's no way we can get an empirical handle on it except to extrapolate. I'm losing my voice here. Extrapolate from microevolution. But how do we know the extrapolation is valid? We don't. Now, what is a species is one of the questions here. And frankly, nobody really has a good handle on that. There are over 25 definitions of species being used by biologists alone because they don't all apply to every case. For example, reproductive isolation is one criterion, but how do you apply that to fossils or to bacteria? You don't. So you have to have different definitions to fit different situations. And there's been no comprehensive treatment that I find adequate anyway of what a species actually is. Excuse me.
Yeah, well, I think we have a series of interactions here. I want to just say that we've enjoyed this opportunity to have you, Dr. Jonathan Wells, with us. And what I'll do is, if I could include the last two questions in a kind of a final email to you, and if you wanted to make a comment on those, then I can just bring those final two questions and post them on our apologetics.org website. How does that sound?
I'll do my best.
Okay. We have totally enjoyed having you with us, Dr. Jonathan Wells. It has been a real honor and privilege for us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Been a pleasure.
And let me just say that we are very active in featuring all the links, the YouTube links for our other cutting edge apologetics webinars. They included Dr. John Lennox that we interviewed right from his home in Oxford, England. That was pretty exciting, and we've had a huge response to that one. We've had similarly huge responses to our webinars with Stephen Meyer on his new book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, and more recently, Dr. Michael Behe speaking about his discoveries of molecular machines, featuring, of course, the original Darwin's black box information, along with Edge of Evolution, Darwin Devolves, and then a mousetrap for Darwin. So we want to encourage you to as we're closing here tonight, just stay around if you could, take a couple of minutes to complete a brief survey that will be available after the meeting concludes. We appreciate that so much. And we are, of course, announcing that our webinar, due to some situational factors, we've had to reschedule our webinar with Hillary Morgan Ferrer of Mama Bear Apologetics. That will be now rescheduled, and we'll let you know as soon as that has been firmed up in the fall. She will be the kickoff of our fall cutting edge webinar. And we are so thrilled and thankful for all the opportunities we've had to bring the best of the best in minds working in the area of evidence seen in nature of a master designer. Thank you. I appreciate all of you attending coast to coast and from many, many foreign countries. Have a great evening.